In 1970, astronomers at the Kitt Peak National Observatory in Arizona pointed one of the most powerful telescopes on Earth at the night sky and photographed something that had never been captured before. Sirius B, the small, dense white dwarf companion star orbiting Sirius A, the star that had been theorized, calculated, and debated in Western astronomy for over a century. The star that required the most advanced optical technology humanity had ever produced to finally see with clarity. The photograph made headlines. Scientists called it a milestone, a confirmation of decades of theoretical work, a triumph of modern instrumentation. Nobody mentioned the Dogon. Nobody stood in front of a camera and said, "There is a people living in the cliffs of Mali who have been teaching their children about this exact star, its orbit, its density, its position relative to Sirius A, for generations beyond the reach of any written record." Nobody asked the obvious question. Nobody said, "If it took us a telescope the size of a building to see this star, how did they know it was there?" The question was inconvenient. So the scientific establishment did what it has always done with inconvenient questions about African knowledge. It looked away. But the Dogon did not look away. They kept teaching. They kept holding their ceremonies. They kept passing down the knowledge that the star was there, that it mattered, and that what it pointed toward in human history was not finished. And in Burkina Faso right now, Ibrahim Traoré is doing something that makes the question of how the Dogon knew about Sirius B feel less like an astronomical curiosity and more like the opening chapter of a story that is still being written. Let me take you inside Dogon cosmology in a way that most documentaries never do. Because the Western fascination with the Dogon has always focused on the wrong thing. It has focused on the star, on the astronomical data, on the question of how a pre-technological people could have known what they knew. That question is real. It deserves serious attention. But it has consistently distracted from the more important question underneath it. Why did the Dogon consider this knowledge sacred? What did the star knowledge mean to them? Not as an astronomical fact, but as a spiritual and historical truth. The Dogon did not teach about Sirius B because they were interested in astrophysics. They taught about Sirius B because it was the home of the Nommo, the primordial beings who, in Dogon tradition, came from that star system and gave humanity its first understanding of justice, of right relationship between peoples, of what a world organized around dignity rather than domination is supposed to look like. The Nommo did not come as conquerors. They did not come to extract. They came to teach. And what they taught was not primarily about the stars. It was about how human beings are supposed to treat each other and how the earth is supposed to be cared for. The Dogon encoded that teaching in everything. In the layout of their villages, which mirror the cosmic order they understood the Nommo to have described. In their masks and ceremonies, which reenact the arrival and the teaching. In the Sigui festival, held every 60 years, which marks the renewal of the covenant between the cosmic order and the human order. And at the center of all of it, the still point around which everything else rotates, is the principle that what has been taken unjustly will be returned, that what has been corrupted will be made right, that the star keeps moving regardless of what human arrangements try to impose on its path. Now look at Ibrahim Traoré, and look at what he has done with the gold. For decades, the gold beneath Burkinabe soil moved in one direction, out of the ground, out of the country, out of the continent, into the accounts of corporations registered in Paris and Toronto and Sydney, and into the retirement funds of executives who could not have found Burkina Faso on a map without assistance. into the financial systems of nations that had already extracted everything they could from this region during the colonial period and had simply found more sophisticated instruments to continue the extraction after the flags came down. The Burkinabe people, the people living above that gold, breathing the dust from the mines, watching the trucks drive past their villages toward processing facilities they did not own, received a fraction of what their earth produced. A fraction structured by contracts negotiated by governments that were, to varying degrees, accountable to Paris before they were accountable to Ouagadougou. This is not speculation. This is documented. The arrangements were legal. They were written down, signed, and enforced. Legality and justice are not the same thing, and the history of Africa's relationship with Western extraction has demonstrated that fact more thoroughly than perhaps any other story in modern history. In June 2025, Ibrahim Traoré ended 5 of those arrangements. 5 foreign-owned gold mining operations nationalized, brought under Burkinabe state control. The revenue redirected toward the people above the ground, rather than the corporations across the ocean. Over $2 billion of domestic debt paid down in a single move, using the resources that had always been there, always been Burkinabe, always belonged to the people who were systematically prevented from benefiting from them. The Nommo, in Dogon tradition, came from Sirius to restore what had been corrupted. Traoré, in Burkina Faso in 2025, took back what had been taken. The Dogon would recognize that pattern. They have been teaching it for 1,000 years. But I want to push further than most discussions of Dogon cosmology go. Because there is something in the Dogon understanding of Sirius B itself, not just what it represents, but what it actually is, that maps onto what is happening with Traoré in a way that is either the most extraordinary coincidence in modern African history or something that deserves to be taken seriously on its own terms. Sirius B is a white dwarf. In astrophysical terms, this means it is the collapsed remnant of a star that once burned brightly, exhausted its fuel, shed its outer layers, and compressed everything that remained into an object of extraordinary density. Something small on the outside that contains enormous mass. Something that, despite its apparent diminishment, exerts a gravitational pull on everything around it. The Dogon described it as the heaviest star, the smallest star, the star that everything else orbits whether it acknowledges that orbit or not. Now consider Burkina Faso. On paper, on the spreadsheets of the international financial institutions, in the indexes and rankings that the Western development industry uses to categorize nations, Burkina Faso appears small, poor, peripheral, a country to be managed, assisted, stabilized, kept from disrupting the larger order around it. But beneath the surface of that paper smallness is something of extraordinary density. Gold, resources. On a population of 23 million people who have been told for generations that they are the recipients of the world's charity, when in fact they are the source of wealth that has been moving outward from their soil for decades. And now, under Traoré, Burkina Faso is exerting a gravitational pull that the surrounding order did not predict and cannot seem to stop. Mali aligned, Niger aligned. The alliance of Sahel states formed, 3 nations that had each made the same break from the old arrangement, now moving together. The French military gone. The IMF conditions rejected. The Sovereign Development Plan announced. $64 billion to be raised primarily from domestic sources. The small star that everything else orbits whether it acknowledges that orbit or not. Well, the Dogon have been describing this dynamic for 1,000 years. They just used the language of the sky to do it. Here is what I want Black America to understand about why this moment is not a West African story. The same system that extracted gold from Burkinabe soil for decades is the same system that extracted labor from enslaved African bodies for centuries. Not metaphorically the same. Historically, documentably, institutionally the same. The wealth that built the financial infrastructure of the Western world, the banks, the trading companies, the insurance markets, the commodity exchanges, was built on the extraction of African resources and African bodies simultaneously. The plantation and the mine were part of the same system. The enslaved person and the colonized laborer were subject to the same logic. When Traoré nationalizes a gold mine, he is doing something that has direct consequences for the descendants of everyone who was ever part of that extraction system. Not because the money flows to Black Americans directly, but because every time a nation successfully breaks from that system, the system's claim to inevitability weakens. Every time a people successfully says this arrangement ends here, the assumption that the arrangement is permanent takes another blow. The Dogon understand this. Their tradition is built on the understanding that corrupted arrangements do not last forever, that the star keeps moving, that the renovation of the world is not a question of whether, but of when. For Black America, the when has always been the agonizing part, the waiting, the watching. The watching of leaders who tried to break from the arrangement being removed, Lumumba, Nkrumah, Sankara, and the question underneath all of it, is this time going to be different? Traoré has survived 23 attempts to remove him. Sankara survived 20 before they succeeded on the 21st. The Dogon would say that the difference between those two numbers is not luck. It is about whether the renovation is far enough advanced that removing the agent can no longer stop the process. Whether what has been set in motion has its own momentum that continues regardless of what happens to any single person. $2 billion of debt paid. Food self-sufficiency achieved. $64 billion development plan announced. The alliance of Sahel states standing. The gold back in Burkinabe hands. But how far advanced does a renovation have to be before it becomes irreversible? The Dogon kept the knowledge of Sirius B when the world around them had no instruments to confirm it. They kept it through centuries, during which the established order would have dismissed it as superstition, mythology, the imaginings of people who did not have the sophistication to understand how the universe actually worked. They kept it because the knowledge was true, and truth does not require external confirmation to remain true. It requires only carriers, people willing to hold it and pass it on until the moment when the conditions exist to demonstrate it. Western science caught up in 1970. The renovation of the world is catching up now. Ibrahim Traoré is 37 years old, but he is standing in the Sahel, 500 miles from the cliffs where the Dogon have kept their knowledge for 1,000 years, and doing something that the Dogon cosmology describes as precisely what happens when the cycle turns and the corrupted arrangement finally meets the force that was always going to undo it. The star was always there. The telescope just could not see it yet. The renovation was always coming. The conditions just had not aligned yet. They are aligning now. Subscribe, because the next video in this series goes deeper into the Dogon star map and what it says about what happens after Traoré. You will not want to miss it.